Tonight, we explore the legend of a book so forbidden, so dangerous, that the Vatican didn't just lock it away, they erased it. A manuscript not written by man or angel, but forged in the dying embers of a forgotten empire. Its pages held truths that could unravel faith, fracture time, and shake the very foundations of history. But recovering it was never meant to be a quest. Those who searched faced locked vaults beneath the earth, faceless inquisitors, and a silence so deep it swallowed entire centuries. And those who found it, they were never heard from again. So, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. They say there was once a book so dangerous, so powerful, that the Vatican didn't just ban it, it erased it. No title, no author, no copies, as if it never existed. But whispered stories still remain. Not in textbooks or sermons, but in old letters, broken inscriptions, and strange footnotes buried in forgotten corners of ancient libraries. A forbidden manuscript said to contain knowledge older than the church itself. A book that didn't preach faith, but understanding. And those who read it, they never spoke of it again. Some called it the Light of Ages. Others claimed it had no name at all, only a symbol etched on its cover, an open eye inside a circle of stars. The few fragments rumoured to have survived don't tell stories of miracles or saints. Instead, they talk of the stars moving through invisible paths, machines powered by water and light, and maps of lands no one should have known existed. No one knows who wrote it. Some say it was the work of a forgotten philosopher from the last days of Rome. Others believe it was compiled by monks who secretly copied the dying knowledge of ancient civilizations, Egyptians, Greeks, Persians, before the fires of censorship consumed their scrolls. What's certain is this. After the early centuries of the Church's rise, all mention of the book vanished. Not just hidden, scrubbed. Entire sections of library catalogues were mysteriously rewritten. Records of missing volumes were edited to say they never existed. But a few clues slipped through. A letter from a 9th century abbot speaks of a manuscript of unspeakable vision sealed beneath a monastery floor. A 14th century mapmaker refers to a source unfit for the eyes of the pious. And in the Vatican's own forbidden index, there's a curious gap, a numbered entry between two banned texts, left blank, as if a title had once been there and was later removed. Could a single book have held such power? Enough to make the most powerful institution in history erase it from the world? Or is that exactly what we're supposed to believe, that it never existed? Tonight, let's begin not with what we know, but what we were never meant to know. Because sometimes the most important part of history isn't what was written down, it's what was carefully, deliberately, and completely made to disappear. And if that book was ever real, then its absence may be the loudest truth of all. Beneath the polished marble floors of Vatican City, deeper than the catacombs and lower than any tourist is ever allowed to wander, lies a vault so secret even most priests will never see it. They call it the Vatican Secret Archive. But its real name, Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, sounds more like a spell than a library. It stretches for miles underground, behind locked doors, stone walls, and silence. Over 50 kilometers of shelving, more than 1 million documents, and only a handful of people in the entire world are allowed to see what's inside. This isn't just a dusty storage room. This is where history disappears. Inside, it's said you'll find letters from kings and emperors, early blueprints of the modern calendar, ancient banned scriptures, and documents so old they're written in languages no one has spoken in over 1,000 years. Some say the original trial records of Galileo are buried there. Others believe there's a lost gospel, one where Jesus didn't perform miracles but taught secret knowledge instead. Then there's the real mystery, what isn't listed. Entire shelves that have no public catalogue, boxes labelled only with numbers, titles that don't appear in any historical archive outside these walls. The Church says it's not hiding anything. They claim secretum doesn't mean secret, it just means private. But when even popes haven't entered every room, when even world-renowned historians have to wait the years just to request one document, then it's fair to ask, what's so private that the whole world must be kept out? No cameras are allowed inside, no copies of documents can leave. And if a scholar's research leads somewhere the Church doesn't like, their access can be quietly denied. No reasons given, no appeal. There are rumours of a room with no official key, just one ancient lock, passed down only to the most trusted guardians. A place where texts sit unread, untouched, because their contents are too dangerous to reveal. Maps that show the world before the flood. Journals from explorers who reached places long before history says they should have. Diagrams of devices we still don't understand today. People say it's for preservation, that too much light or handling could damage the pages. But paper isn't the only thing being protected, it's power. Because if the wrong truth ever got out, if someone found a document that proved history was edited or time itself was shifted, it wouldn't just rewrite the past. It would shake the foundation of everything built on it. And maybe that's why the vault remains silent. Not because it has nothing to say, but because if it ever spoke, the world might not be ready to listen. What if the year you were born into wasn't real? Not just the date, but the whole idea of time itself. What if someone had added years that never happened, rewritten the calendar, and made us all believe we were further along in history than we actually are? It sounds impossible until you realise how few people ever controlled how time was measured in the first place. We trust that we're living in the year 2025, but that number didn't fall from the sky. It was chosen, decided. And the ones who made that decision were the same people who held all the records, all the manuscripts, and all the power, the Church. Back in the early Middle Ages, most people didn't even know what year it was. Time was marked by harvests, holy days, and the lives of kings. But then came the calendar, the Julian first, then the Gregorian, designed and declared by popes, priests, and scholars, working under the Church's watchful eye. They weren't just correcting dates, they were creating a timeline, one that made sense to them, one that suited the story they wanted to tell. There's a theory, quiet, controversial, but growing, that nearly 300 years were added to history. Specifically, the years between 614 and 911 AD. Historians call it the phantom time hypothesis. According to this idea, events, kings, even entire wars during that period didn't actually happen. They were inserted, fabricated, or copied from earlier times and given new names. Think about it. Why is there so little documentation from that gap? Why do the stars, actual records of eclipses and planetary movements, fail to match the historical dates we've been given? Why do some emperors feel like repeats of past rulers with slightly different costumes? The name that always surfaces in this mystery is the Vatican. Because when Rome fell, the Church rose, and with it, the power to shape not just belief, but memory. By adjusting the calendar, they could create the illusion of prophecy fulfilled, of divine succession, of a world guided by sacred timing. If a pope needed to prove his place in a holy lineage, all he had to do was stretch the timeline. If an emperor wanted to show that his rule had been destined, all he had to do was erase the years that contradicted him. Most people never noticed, because once a story is printed in textbooks, taught in school, and carved into stone, it stops being questioned. It becomes real, and time, our most trusted constant, becomes just another chapter in a book rewritten long ago. Maybe we're not living in 2025. Maybe it's 1725, or some year we can't even name, because when time is controlled, so is truth. And when the past is adjusted, the present becomes whatever they want it to be. They were called scribes. But in truth, they were the gatekeepers of the past. Long after the Roman Empire crumbled, when libraries turned to ash and scholars vanished from the cities, one group still held pens in their hands: monks. Hidden behind monastery walls, far from the noise of collapsing kingdoms, they became the quiet rulers of what would be remembered and what would be forgotten. Most people think monks just copied the Bible all day. And they did, over and over again, page by page, year after year. But it wasn't only scripture. At one time, they had access to scrolls from ancient Greece, Rome, Persia, works by Aristotle, Galen, Euclid. Knowledge of science, medicine, astronomy, philosophy. But here's the twist. They didn't copy everything. They chose. Anything that didn't align with church doctrine, ideas about evolution, heliocentrism, or even non-Christian ethics was considered dangerous, heretical, useless for saving the soul. So those manuscripts were left to rot or quietly destroyed. Only what fit the faith survived. And even then, it was rewritten, not in the clear Latin of ancient Rome, but in ecclesiastical Latin, a version so twisted by theology that even educated people could barely read it without training from the church itself. This meant only a select few, high-ranking monks, abbots, bishops, could truly access the past. They didn't need to burn every book. They just had to keep them locked away, translated into a language no one else understood. That's how control works. Not by violence, but by limiting who gets to read. In the Middle Ages, owning a book was like owning a spaceship today. Rare, expensive, mysterious. Most people were illiterate. And even if they could read, there was nothing to read except what the church provided. That's not a coincidence. That was the design. Across Europe, monastic orders, like the Benedictines and the Dominicans, became the quiet librarians of civilization. But they weren't just preserving knowledge, they were filtering it, editing it, turning human history into a carefully curated shelf, one where every volume was approved and every page served a purpose. And somewhere, lost in that silence, are the voices that never made it through. Imagine how many truths were buried, not because they were false, but because they were inconvenient. How many inventions, philosophies, and stories were erased by the stroke of a monk's pen, not out of malice, but obedience, because they believed they were protecting the world from error. But in doing so, they created a different kind of error, one that would echo through centuries. A world where people would grow up not knowing what was lost, because they'd never seen it to begin with. And all of it started in a stone room, with a candle, a quill, and a decision to copy or to let the silence take its place. Somewhere in the deep vaults beneath the Vatican, there are books no one can read, not because they're too damaged or too old, but because they're written in languages no one understands anymore. Not Latin, not Greek, not even ancient Hebrew or Aramaic. These are symbols, scripts, and strange curves that don't match any known tongue. It's as if someone left messages behind, and then erased the key to ever decoding them. They call them untranslated manuscripts. A few pages have slipped out over the centuries, torn fragments, coded journals, scrolls with bizarre diagrams and unfamiliar alphabets. Scholars try to explain them. Some say they're written in a cipher, others that they're an early dialect we just haven't cracked yet. But what if there's something else entirely? A lost language not meant to be understood by just anyone. A language of truth buried on purpose. There's a theory that before the Church took control of history, before even the fall of Rome, there were groups, philosophers, mystics, and scientists who wrote in a kind of code, not to confuse, but to protect. They knew knowledge could be powerful, even dangerous, and if the wrong hands found it, it could be twisted, weaponized, or simply destroyed. So they hid it in plain sight, in texts no ordinary reader could make sense of, not unless they already knew how to see. One of the most famous of these mysterious works is the Voynich manuscript, a real book discovered in the early 1900s, filled with drawings of unknown plants, strange star maps, and writing that no one, even with today's technology, has been able to translate. Some believe it's a hoax, others think it's the last remaining piece of a lost system of knowledge. What makes it more eerie is that parts of it resemble diagrams found in early Vatican manuscripts, but the Church has never officially commented. What if there are hundreds more like it, locked away, filed under undecipherable, marked as irrelevant, when in fact they hold the pieces of a forgotten truth? What if the reason we can't understand them isn't because they're nonsense, but because the language they speak was silenced? Imagine a world where knowledge once flowed freely, not in Latin sermons, but in living symbols. A script that combined science, art, and philosophy in one. Then imagine that world being slowly erased, the symbols hidden, the meaning lost, not to time, but to control. If that kind of language ever existed, then maybe it still echoes in the corners of forgotten monasteries, in carvings no one's noticed, in books the Vatican never released. And maybe, just maybe, someone, somewhere, still remembers how to read the truth no one else is allowed to find. We're told there was a time when Europe went dark, not from nightfall or war, but from ignorance. No inventions, no progress. Just peasants in rags, muddy roads, and a church holding the only candle in a world that forgot how to think. That's what history books call the Dark Ages. But what if that darkness wasn't real? What if it was painted over something else? Something the world was never meant to see? There's something strange about the story. An empire as powerful as Rome collapses, and suddenly people forget how to build roads, how to read the stars, how to make soap. Whole cities vanish from records, inventions go missing, great minds stop appearing. And for nearly 1,000 years, there's barely a trace of human progress. That doesn't sound like a natural fall. That sounds like a cover-up. In the East, things were different. While Europe was supposedly asleep, China was inventing the compass and printing press. The Islamic world was performing surgery, charting stars, translating ancient Greek texts. But in Europe, nothing, just silence. A blank page where entire centuries should be. The truth is, not everything stopped. Pieces of progress did survive. Advanced tools have been found buried beneath old villages. Gear systems, astrolabes, buildings with techniques we still can't explain. But they're called anomalies, like accidents that don't fit the story. Instead of asking how they existed, most historians quietly move on. Why? Because the story of the Dark Ages serves a purpose. If people believe they came from darkness, they're more likely to worship the ones who claim to have brought the light. And who controlled the story? The church. The only ones copying books. The only ones allowed to teach. The only ones who decided what counted as history and what didn't. So they painted the centuries black, covered the walls with shadows, told generation after generation that between Rome and the Renaissance there was nothing but superstition. No science, no art, no truth. But shadows only exist when something stands in the light. And maybe, just maybe, the light was always there, only hidden. Because you can't erase 1,000 years of human thought without help. You have to control the books, the schools, the maps, the stories, and once you've done that, you don't have to burn the truth. You just bury it in silence. The Dark Ages may not have been dark at all. Maybe they were just dimmed, on purpose. And the glow that still remains, the strange inventions, the unexplainable maps, the forgotten names, they're not accidents. They're echoes of a world we were never supposed to remember. Imagine discovering something that could change the world. A machine, a cure, a way to map the stars, and then being told to stop. Not because it's wrong, but because it doesn't fit a sacred book. That was the reality for anyone chasing truth in medieval Europe. Science wasn't just discouraged, it was feared, and the place that feared it most, the very institution that claimed to hold the ultimate truth, the Vatican. During the so-called Dark Ages, the church wasn't just a place to pray, it was the centre of power. It controlled schools, books, and laws. And it had one rule: everything had to align with Scripture, not with evidence, not with observation, just with what had already been written. If a scientist discovered something that didn't match the Bible's version of the world, it wasn't seen as progress, it was seen as rebellion. Saying the earth wasn't the centre of the universe? Heresy. Suggesting disease came from bacteria instead of sin? Dangerous. Even questioning how old the world really was could get you locked away or worse. But this wasn't about religion. It was about control. The Vatican didn't hate knowledge, it hoarded it. Behind monastery walls and deep inside secret archives, monks were translating and copying ancient texts from Greece, Rome, and the Arab world. Medical journals, astronomical charts, complex mathematics, but most of it never reached the public. It was kept under lock and key, saved for the right time or the right people, meaning those who wouldn't challenge the church's version of reality. Some scientists tried to stay quiet, others tried to speak. Roger Bacon, an early thinker who believed in testing ideas through experiments, was imprisoned by his own order. Giordano Bruno, who said stars were suns with their own planets, was burned alive. Galileo, after proving the Earth moved around the sun, was forced to say he was wrong just to stay alive. The church didn't need to destroy every discovery. It just had to silence the people who made them. That was enough to make the rest stay quiet. And so for centuries, progress slowed. Not because people were dumb, not because ideas didn't exist, but because every step forward had to pass through a gate guarded by fear, faith, and silence. When science became a threat, Scripture became a wall, and behind that wall, the future was delayed, not by war, not by ignorance, but by design. Because when you control the truth, you don't have to lie. You just have to stop anyone else from speaking. We all take the calendar for granted. January to December, 365 days a year, and we're told it's always been this way. But what if the calendar itself was part of the story being controlled? What if changing how we measure time was one of the most powerful ways to rewrite history without anyone noticing? In the year 1582, the Catholic Church made a bold move. Pope Gregory XIII introduced a new calendar, the one we still use today. It was called the Gregorian calendar, and it replaced the older Julian calendar, which had been used since Roman times. On paper, the change was about fixing small errors. The Julian system had miscalculated the solar year by just 11 minutes, but over centuries, that tiny mistake had added up, shifting important religious dates out of place. So what did the church do? They erased 10 days from the calendar. One day it was October 4th, the next day it was October 15th. Just like that, time was deleted. Most people accepted it. They had no choice. But hidden behind the correction was something deeper. By taking control of the calendar, the Vatican took control of history. It wasn't just about leap years and Easter. It was about deciding what year it was. And when you can declare the year, you can shape the past. Around that same time, rumours began to swirl. What if more than just 10 days were erased? What if entire centuries had been added or shifted to fit a narrative? That's the heart of a theory known as the phantom time hypothesis. It suggests that nearly 300 years between the 6th and the 10th century might never have happened at all. That the historical records from that time are either missing, copied, or made up, and the calendar changes helped cover it. It sounds wild until you look closer. Those missing years are some of the least documented in European history. Eclipses and star maps from that era don't match modern timelines. Certain kings, like Charlemagne, seem suspiciously similar to earlier rulers, as if their stories were duplicated with different names. And who was in the perfect position to adjust it all? The Vatican. They had the libraries, they had the scribes, they had the power to say what year it was, and no one could argue. Changing the calendar wasn't just a correction, it was a reset. A way to clean up the timeline, to smooth out the gaps, and to bury the pieces that didn't fit. Because when you can edit time itself, the past becomes flexible, the future becomes controllable, and the present becomes a story told by those who hold the calendar. In the year 1513, an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis drew a map that should not exist. It was detailed, strange, and centuries ahead of its time. It showed the coastlines of South America and Africa with stunning accuracy at a time when much of the world was still considered unknown. Even more shocking, it included a landmass that looked eerily like Antarctica without ice. That detail alone shattered everything historians believed about who knew what and when. Piri Reis didn't claim he discovered these lands himself. He said his map was copied from older ones, passed down through time. Some from the Greeks, some from sailors long forgotten. One, he claimed, came from a map captured from Christopher Columbus. But here's the problem. Those source maps no longer exist. They've disappeared. And the only place that might still hold them? The vaults of the Vatican. Why would the Church care about old maps? Because maps aren't just drawings. They're records of knowledge. They show what the world was believed to be at a certain point in time. And if a map proves that someone knew about South America or Antarctica hundreds or even thousands of years before Columbus set sail, then the whole timeline we've been taught begins to fall apart. That's why Piri, Reis, and others like him were considered dangerous. Not because they lied, but because their truth didn't match the official story. Other strange maps exist too. The Oronce Fine map from the early 1600s also shows Antarctica. long before it was officially discovered. The Zeno map, the Dulcet Portolano, the Boache map, all from different times, different hands, yet somehow showing places no one was supposed to know about. So, how did these cartographers get it right? How did they map coastlines using techniques we didn't publicly develop until satellites? The answer might be that they didn't create the maps at all. They preserved them. Ancient civilizations may have known far more about the world than we give them credit for, but their knowledge was slowly erased or taken. When the Vatican rose to power, it wasn't just theology they guarded, it was geography. Their archives hold one of the largest collections of ancient maps in the world, but almost none have been made public. Less than 1% has ever been copied or shared. The rest stays hidden. What are they protecting? Old maps or old truths? If someone can erase a name from history, they can erase a journey. And if you erase enough journeys, the whole world becomes smaller, safer, easier to control. Piri Reis didn't just draw coastlines, he drew a doorway, a glimpse into a past we've forgotten or were never allowed to remember. And maybe that's why the map still survives. Not as proof of discovery, but as evidence of a lie that's lasted far too long. For most of history, people believed the sky told the truth. The stars didn't lie, didn't change their story, and couldn't be edited. When an eclipse happened, it left behind a cosmic timestamp, something so precise that even today, modern computers can rewind time and tell you exactly when and where it appeared in the sky. That's why astronomy has always been dangerous to anyone trying to rewrite the past. Because if the sky doesn't match the story, then maybe the story was wrong all along. During the Middle Ages, Europe fell under a kind of sleep, or so we're told. Very few records, very few events. And when historians started matching those records to actual astronomical data, eclipses, comets, planetary movements, something strange happened. The numbers didn't add up. Events said to have happened during certain years didn't line up with the stars. For example, a medieval chronicle might say an eclipse happened on a specific day over a certain city. But when scientists ran the numbers backward, they found no eclipse in that place, sometimes not even in that decade. In other cases, real eclipses that did happen were never mentioned at all. It was as if centuries had been stretched, compressed, or stitched together with missing pieces. This wasn't just a mistake, it pointed to something bigger. If the sky says something didn't happen when history says it did, then who do we believe, the stars or the scribes? The church didn't like that question. Astronomy was once a sacred science. Ancient cultures used it to build temples, track seasons, and navigate oceans. But in medieval Europe, it became something else, something suspicious. If you looked at the sky too closely, asked too many questions, or pointed out a timeline error, you weren't seen as curious, you were seen as dangerous, heretical, a threat to the carefully constructed story that had been told for generations. The Vatican controlled time not just with calendars, but with silence. They had their own astronomers, their own observatories, and their own star charts, some of which were never shared with the outside world. If an eclipse didn't match the approved history, it was either ignored or explained away. Scholars who dug too deep into these cosmic inconsistencies found themselves banned, silenced, or erased from academic memory. But the stars remember. Even now, modern astronomy continues to reveal things that history cannot explain. Gaps, overlaps, echoes of events that may have been duplicated or misplaced. It's not just about science, it's about memory. And when the stars and the timeline disagree, maybe it's not the sky that's wrong. Maybe it's the story we've been told to believe. Because truth, like light, travels forever, even if you try to hide it. In medieval Europe, going to school didn't mean learning how the world worked. It meant learning how not to ask. From the moment a child picked up a pen, they were taught not to discover, but to obey. Education wasn't about opening minds. It was about closing them carefully, silently, and completely. Most schools were run by the church. That meant every lesson passed through a filter, the Bible. Children learned to read only so they could read scripture. They copied verses, memorized sermons, and were tested on their ability to repeat, not to question. Ideas about the stars, medicine, or how the body worked weren't part of the lesson unless they fit church doctrine. And if something didn't fit, it wasn't debated, it was erased. The church believed obedience was the highest virtue. A smart child who asked questions was a risk. A quiet one who followed the rules was holy. So the system trained young minds to associate thinking differently with danger. Doubt became sin, curiosity became pride, and pride, they said, was the road to ruin. Even monks, who spent their entire lives studying, were often only allowed to read specific parts of the Bible. Whole sections were kept hidden. Other books, ancient Greek philosophy, medical texts, astronomy, were locked away, translated into Latin that only a few were ever taught to understand. This meant that knowledge existed just out of reach, close enough to feel, but never touch. Children were raised in a version of history where the church had always been the light in a world of darkness. They weren't taught about the Muslim scholars who preserved ancient science, or the Chinese inventors creating paper, printing, and the compass. They didn't learn that the so-called Dark Ages may not have been dark at all. They were simply told that without the church there was nothing, and so they believed. And when a whole generation grows up inside a cage made of lessons and prayers, they don't even see the bars. They think it's the sky. The trick wasn't just in what was taught, it was in what was never mentioned. No critical thinking, no exploration, no alternative views. Just a single path, repeated over and over, until it became the only one that seemed to exist. That's how you erase knowledge without burning it. You hide it behind silence. You raise children who never learn to ask, and you call it education. But real education doesn't fear questions. It invites them. And when a system is built to stop you from wondering what else is out there, it's not school, it's a script. And if history is a story written by those in power, then medieval classrooms were where the first pages of forgetting began. In the Middle Ages, it wasn't just what you said that could get you killed. It was the fact that you thought it. Ideas weren't judged by whether they were true or false. They were judged by whether they matched the story the church approved. And if they didn't, the punishment wasn't just silence, it was fire. We often hear about heretics being burned at the stake, but we don't always understand why. These weren't criminals. Many were scientists, doctors, historians, people who simply asked the wrong questions. What is the universe made of? How does the human body really work? What if time wasn't what we thought? These weren't attacks on faith. They were acts of curiosity. And for that, they were seen as threats. The church held absolute power, not just over religion, but over truth itself. If someone discovered something that didn't match scripture, they weren't allowed to explore it. They were told to stop. And if they didn't stop, the consequences came fast. Not always with flames, sometimes with chains, sometimes with exile, sometimes with a quiet disappearance no one dared talk about. One of the most tragic examples is Giordano Bruno. He believed that stars were suns with their own worlds, that the universe was infinite, and that truth could not be contained in any single book. For that, he was arrested, held for 7 years, then burned alive in a Roman square while the crowd prayed. Not because he was wrong, but because he thought beyond the box they had built for him. It wasn't just about keeping power, it was about controlling the very act of thinking. If people began to question the stars, the earth, the church, they might start questioning everything else too. And that was dangerous to an institution that ruled not by force, but by belief. That's why the church didn't just burn books, it burned the minds behind them. Scholars who spent years studying lost everything in a day. Their writings were destroyed, their names erased, their families threatened. Some chose to lie and say they were wrong just to survive. Others stayed silent for life. And over time, the message was clear. Thinking for yourself could cost you everything. This is how fear replaces curiosity, how silence becomes safer than truth. And once enough people stop asking questions, no one remembers what it felt like to ask them at all. In history, we often talk about the loss of knowledge, as if it just disappeared on its own. But the truth is, it was hunted. Not with swords, but with fire. Not just to kill the body, but to burn the very idea that you had the right to think differently. And the flames still echo, not in the streets, but in the gaps of everything we were never taught to question. There was a list, not of enemies, not of criminals, but of books. Books that were never allowed to be read, spoken about, or even owned. The church called it the Index of Forbidden Books, and for over 400 years it quietly shaped what the world was allowed to know. It began in the 16th century, when printing presses had started spreading knowledge faster than the church could control. Suddenly, people were reading things for themselves, questioning, doubting, exploring ideas that didn't pass through a pulpit. To stop it, the Vatican created the Index, a list of works that were too dangerous for the public. Some books denied church doctrine, others offered scientific ideas that challenged old beliefs. Some were simply written by people the church didn't trust. Once a book was added to the Index, it was officially banned. Owning it could get you arrested. Reading it could lead to excommunication. In some cases, it meant prison or worse. Priests were ordered to search private libraries. Books were burned in town squares, while crowds watched in silence. And, most chilling of all, some works were never even published because authors knew what could happen if they wrote the wrong words. The index grew quickly. It included Galileo, who showed that Earth moved around the sun. It included Descartes, who dared to say, "I think, therefore I am." Even scientific books about the human body, the stars, or medicine were listed, because if they contradicted scripture, they were considered heresy, no matter how true they were. The church claimed the index was created to protect the faithful from being misled. But over time, it became clear. It wasn't about protecting people, it was about protecting power. The scariest part? Most people never even knew what was being kept from them, because the banned books weren't just locked away, they were made to disappear, erased from schools, hidden from libraries, not mentioned in sermons or lectures. Whole generations grew up never hearing about the ideas that had once filled those pages. To them, it wasn't censorship, it was just silence. Even as the world changed, the index remained. It wasn't officially abolished until the year 1966, but by then, the damage was already done. Knowledge had been shaped by what was allowed. The rest had been lost in time, burned, buried, or forgotten. A banned book isn't always dangerous because of what it says. Sometimes it's dangerous because of what it makes people ask. What if this is true? What else have we been kept from knowing? And in a world where a list like that could exist for centuries, maybe the real question isn't which books were forbidden, but why they had to be hidden at all. Throughout history, some of the brightest minds have vanished just when they were about to uncover something big. Not in battles or accidents, but in silence, right after making a discovery that challenged the official story. These weren't just random tragedies. These were scholars, researchers, and thinkers who had one thing in common. They got too close to something someone didn't want revealed. One of the strangest cases is Hypatia of Alexandria, a brilliant philosopher and mathematician from the ancient world. She taught astronomy and believed in science over superstition. But in a time when the church was rising, that made her dangerous. She was murdered by a mob publicly, her writings destroyed, her name buried for centuries. Much later, in the 17th century, Athanasius Kircher, a Jesuit scholar, became obsessed with translating mysterious ancient scripts. He believed there were lost civilizations far older than anyone imagined, and that the Vatican might be sitting on records of them. His work suddenly stopped. The translations were never finished. No explanation was given. In modern times, there are stories of archaeologists who uncovered strange maps or artifacts in old monasteries, only to disappear during their research trips. A German historian in the 1940s claimed to have found a link between medieval records and the phantom time theory, the idea that centuries of history may have been invented. He died in a supposed accident before publishing his final paper. The notes he left behind? Gone. A researcher in the 1980s said he found inconsistencies between eclipse data and medieval event timelines, proof that the calendar might have been altered. Days before his work was set to be published, he suffered a sudden stroke. The journal refused to release his findings. His family was told not to push further. One pattern keeps repeating. Scholars who ask quiet questions about time, history, or forbidden knowledge often end up silenced, not just in life, but in memory. Their books go unpublished. Their names vanish from university archives. And slowly, they're replaced by safer versions of truth. It's not always easy to prove something sinister happened. That's the genius of it. These deaths look like bad luck, natural illness, or personal misfortune. But when the same kind of thinker, those who question the timeline, who challenge what the church recorded, who dig into places they're not supposed to, keep going missing, you start to wonder, maybe it's not about one person. Maybe it's about a system built to protect a story that can't afford to change. Because in a world where knowledge is power, a single discovery can shake everything. And sometimes, the people who get too close to the truth don't just lose their careers, they lose everything. And the rest of us are left with only a rumour, a page torn from history, and a name that almost changed the world, but disappeared instead. In old European towns, there are cathedrals built with impossible precision. Stone towers that rise hundreds of feet into the air, carved with symbols, angles, and patterns that seem more like blueprints than decoration. Water systems hidden beneath cities that still function today without modern parts. Enormous clocks that track planets, tides, and time with eerie accuracy. But when people asked how these things were made, they weren't told about architects or engineers. They were told it was a miracle. During the Middle Ages, the church had an answer for everything it didn't want to explain. If something was too advanced, too strange, or simply too far ahead of its time, it was declared divine. A saint had blessed the ground. An angel had whispered the design. A holy vision had guided the builders. And just like that, science became invisible and faith took the credit. People were taught to stop looking for logic If a massive dome stayed up without collapsing, it wasn't because of math. It was because a relic had been placed beneath the foundation. If a stained glass window caught the light just right at the exact moment of a holy day, it wasn't careful geometry, it was God's presence. And if an underground tunnel brought clean water to a monastery, no one asked how it was dug or how it stayed clean. They just called it sacred. But these weren't miracles, they were mechanisms. Many of these structures, bridges, towers, irrigation systems, used knowledge from ancient Rome, Greece, and even the Middle East. Knowledge passed down in secret, hidden in diagrams, or buried in old texts no one was supposed to read. The church may have preserved some of it, but it never shared where it came from. Instead, it covered engineering with stories of saints and silence. One church in France still has a spiral staircase that seems to float, with no central support. No one knows exactly how it was built. Locals say it was made by a saint in one night. But architects who study it today see something else. Advanced structural balance, a deep understanding of force, weight, and motion. Not magic, just math. It's easier to control people when they believe they need miracles to survive, when they think answers only come from heaven. Because once you believe you can never understand the world without a priest, you stop trying to understand it at all. So the inventions were hidden behind halos. The engineers became nameless, and the machines were turned into myths. But if you look closely, the truth is still there, carved into stone, hidden in symbols, built into walls that have stood for centuries. It's not what people were allowed to see. It's what they were trained to never look for. Because every miracle that replaced a mechanism didn't just erase a person. It erased the proof that humans have always been capable of more than they were told to believe. History is supposed to be a chain, one year linked to the next, stories passed down, rulers remembered, events recorded. But if you look closely at Europe's past, you'll find something strange. There are gaps, not tiny ones, but wide, yawning holes where whole lifetimes should be. Kings who ruled but left behind no laws, no battles, no letters. Entire cities that vanished without explanation. Centuries that feel more like faded dreams than lived reality. Take the 7th century, for example. According to the timeline, Europe had rulers, wars, and even religious reforms. But when you go looking for the details, actual documents, buildings, art, you find almost nothing. No first-hand letters, no clear journals, no real trace of people who supposedly ruled for decades. The only records that survive were written centuries after the fact, mostly by monks. It's like someone filled in the blanks long after the story had already faded. Then there are the kings. Some ruled for 20 or 30 years, yet not a single coin, seal, or signed order from them exists. How does a ruler leave no trace, not even a signature? And why do some monarchs seem suspiciously similar to rulers who came before? Same deeds, same victories, different names? Were they real, or just recycled characters meant to fill in empty space? Even churches built during this time raise questions. We're told they were created during eras of chaos, when Europe was supposedly lost in superstition and poverty. Yet the stonework is precise, the architecture advanced, the designs often match knowledge that was supposedly forgotten until centuries later. So who really built them, and when? Most people never notice these gaps because history is usually taught in smooth lines. Rome falls, the Dark Ages begin, the Renaissance follows. But the real story isn't so neat. In fact, it's messy, and sometimes it's suspiciously too clean. Some scholars think parts of the timeline were stretched, that events were copied, moved, or even invented to make history feel complete. Others believe entire chapters were deleted, erased, because they didn't fit the narrative that the church wanted to tell. And the strangest thing? The church never seems eager to explain the gaps. They just move on, as if those missing centuries were perfectly normal. But history doesn't forget on its own. Stories don't vanish without reason. So when you see a blank space, where there should be noise, where people should have lived, built, ruled, and remembered, you have to ask why. Maybe the past wasn't lost. Maybe it was hidden, or rewritten, or paused. And maybe the truth isn't in what's written in the textbooks, but in what's been carefully left out. Because sometimes, the silence between the words says more than the words ever could. In the puzzle of history, some pieces look like they've been used more than once. Kings with different names, but the same victories. Emperors who ruled in different centuries, but followed nearly identical paths. It's like reading the same story again and again, just with a new cover and slightly changed characters. And the deeper you look, the stranger it gets. Take Charlemagne, the great ruler of the early 9th century. Historians say he united most of Europe, reformed education, and brought light back to a dark world. But when you compare his story to Constantine the Great, who lived 500 years earlier, the similarities are too many to ignore. Both were deeply tied to the church. Both expanded their empires with divine approval. Both were said to have seen visions. Even their laws and titles feel like reflections. It's almost as if Charlemagne was a reboot, a rewritten version of a man who came before him. And he's not the only one. Across medieval Europe, you find rulers whose names change from region to region, but whose actions stay eerily the same. One prince unites a scattered land through faith and war. Another king builds great churches and is crowned by a pope. Over and over, the pattern repeats. But when you dig into the details, letters, coins, architecture, you often find only one set of evidence. One version that somehow got copied, renamed, and moved to a different century. Some scholars have started to ask, were these people real, or were they literary echoes? Were scribes under pressure to fill in the missing years by borrowing from older stories? And if the church controlled most of the writing and copying, how easy would it have been to recycle a narrative that made them look strong, holy, and eternal? Even saints fall into the same pattern. Dozens of early martyrs share nearly identical life stories, born noble, converted in secret, persecuted, and martyred in dramatic fashion. Some even have the same miracles, healing the blind, surviving fire, or speaking after death. Yet many of these saints have no confirmed graves, no historical evidence, and no mention outside of church documents. Were they real? Or were their stories tools, meant to inspire faith? Yes, but also to replace the stories that were too dangerous to keep. In a way, this isn't just about names, it's about memory. If the same story is told again and again, eventually it becomes truth, even if it wasn't real the first time. And if the past can be repeated with different faces, how much of it was ever original? Maybe history isn't a straight timeline. Maybe it's more like a mirror maze, reflections stacked on reflections, until no one remembers where the real image began. And in that confusion, whoever writes the story holds all the power. Because when the same story echoes for centuries, you stop noticing the repetition and start calling it fact. Forgetting doesn't always happen by accident. Sometimes it's carefully designed, planned like a blueprint. Not by changing the story, but by deciding which parts never get told in the first place. And when it comes to history, The most powerful kind of control isn't about creating lies, it's about leaving things out. Imagine building a giant puzzle. You have thousands of pieces, each with a bit of truth, but someone quietly removes just a few, enough so that certain shapes never connect. The picture looks mostly complete, but something's missing. You can't see what's wrong because the holes aren't obvious, but without them, you'll never see the full image. That's how historical omission works. It doesn't scream. It whispers. It hides in the quiet. The church didn't have to rewrite every book. All it had to do was decide what wasn't worth copying. A text questioning the shape of the earth, left behind. A scroll describing how ancient engineers moved massive stones without modern machines, forgotten. A map that didn't match their version of the world, stored away or destroyed. Over time, entire generations grew up without ever knowing those ideas existed. And because those ideas were gone, no one thought to ask the questions. That's the trick. If you don't know something was removed, you don't go looking for it. You think the silence is normal. You believe the gaps are just empty space, not erased knowledge. It happened in libraries, in monasteries, in the margins of copied books. A sentence left out, a chapter never translated, a name removed from the record. Not because it was false, but because it didn't fit the version of truth the church wanted to preserve. Omission isn't just about hiding. It's about reshaping the story so that the present looks like it came from a clean, simple past. One where faith always guided light, where darkness came only from those who strayed. It builds a path where every step leads to the church's door. And when every alternative voice has been removed, that path becomes the only one left. But the signs of the blueprint are still there. Gaps in the timeline. Stories that seem unfinished. Civilizations that left behind advanced tools but no written record of how they worked. Echoes of people who should have been remembered but weren't. You don't have to burn a book to erase its power. You just have to make sure no one ever reads it. You don't need to lie. Just don't tell the whole truth. And over time, people won't just forget what was missing. They'll never even know it was gone. That's the blueprint for forgetting. Not destruction, just silence. And silence, when held long enough, becomes the loudest lie ever told. In the still, candle-lit halls of old monasteries, where the air smelled of ink and dust, a quiet rebellion was unfolding. Not with swords or protests, but with quills. While the world believed monks spent their days copying scripture and praying in silence, a few of them were hiding something much greater. They were saving knowledge the world was supposed to forget. Most monks followed the rules. They copied only what the church approved: Bible verses, sermons, lives of saints. But a few noticed something strange. They found old scrolls in the back of libraries, texts in Greek, Arabic or Latin, filled with strange diagrams, star charts, or theories that didn't match what the church was teaching. The monks were told to ignore them, destroy them even, but some couldn't. These silent monks understood what they were looking at. Some had studied ancient languages. Others had simply seen too much to pretend they hadn't. They knew the names: Ptolemy, Archimedes, Galen. Scientists, philosophers, engineers, from a time before the church rewrote the world. And they realized that if they didn't preserve this knowledge, it would vanish forever. So they copied it. Late at night, when no one was watching, they tucked pages inside false covers. They rewrote medical texts beneath layers of scripture. They drew machines in the margins of religious books, gears and pulleys disguised as decorative flourishes. Some even created coded languages, so only certain readers could understand what was really written. They didn't do it for fame. They knew their work could never be seen. If caught, they'd be branded heretics, locked away, or worse. So they stayed silent, they obeyed on the surface. But in the shadows, they saved the past. One monk in Spain copied a banned astronomy book and hid it inside the walls of his cell. Another in Italy retranslated an ancient Greek medical guide into Latin and disguised it as a prayer manual. In Ireland, monks are said to have buried texts beneath stone chapels, waiting for a future that might need them. And maybe, with that future, some of these hidden works were discovered centuries later, long after their authors were forgotten. Historians found strange texts in monasteries that had burned down or buried beneath library floors. In some cases, it was clear these books weren't just saved, they were protected. The monks who did this didn't fight with armies. They fought with memory, with paper, with silence. They understood that the truth could outlast lies if it was written down and hidden well enough. And even though history erased their names, their work still echoes. Every time we rediscover one of those forbidden texts, we're hearing their whisper across time. They couldn't speak, but they still found a way to be heard. Tucked away in the Egyptian desert, buried for over 1,000 years, a scroll was found that the church never wanted anyone to read. It wasn't a magic spell or a forgotten prophecy. It was a gospel, one that claimed to speak in the voice of Jesus. But this gospel didn't talk about turning water into wine or walking on water. It talked about something far more dangerous, finding the truth inside yourself. They call it the Gospel of Thomas. And unlike the 4 Gospels you find in the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, this one was left out. Not because it was fake, not because it was proven wrong, but because it said something the early church couldn't control. Instead of telling stories, the Gospel of Thomas is filled with short sayings, almost like riddles. Some sound familiar, others are strange, almost dreamlike. But one message comes up again and again, that the kingdom of God isn't up in the sky or in some faraway place, it's within you. That the truth isn't something you get from a priest or a book, but something you already carry inside. And that scared the people in charge. The church taught that salvation came through obedience, through rules, rituals, and the authority of the priesthood. But Thomas offered a different path, one that didn't require a gatekeeper, one that said you didn't need anyone else to speak to the divine. So what did they do? They buried it, literally. In the year 1945, a farmer digging near Nag Hammadi in Egypt uncovered a sealed clay jar. Inside were a bunch of leather-bound books, all written in Coptic, an old Egyptian language. Among them was the Gospel of Thomas. It had survived only because it had been hidden, protected from fire, war, and the church's long reach. Scholars were stunned. Here was a gospel as old, maybe even older, than the ones in the Bible. And yet, it had been left out of the canon, cast aside as heresy. Some church leaders said it was too mystical, too hard to understand. But others knew the real reason. It gave people too much freedom. It told them the divine spark wasn't something they had to earn. It was already theirs. Thomas wasn't alone. There were other banned gospels too, like the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, and the Gospel of Judas. All part of a larger group of hidden writings known as the Apocrypha, texts that were once read and debated, but eventually pushed aside when the church decided which stories were official and which ones were too dangerous. But the Gospel of Thomas still whispers. Its words have outlived the fire, the silence, and the edits. And they still ask the same question. What if the truth was never locked in a book, but buried inside you, waiting to be remembered? In a dusty papyrus discovered in the late 19th century, a voice speaks that most people never expected to hear. Mary Magdalene, not as a side character, not as the woman crying at the foot of the cross, but as a leader, a teacher, someone who understood Jesus better than anyone else, and who told a version of his message that's been missing ever since. It's called the Gospel of Mary, and it's nothing like what you find in the New Testament. In this Gospel, Jesus doesn't come to die for the sins of the world. He comes to teach people how to wake up, to understand themselves, to let go of fear and find freedom within. He speaks in parables and symbols, showing that the true battle isn't against the world, it's inside the human mind. He tells Mary that the soul's journey is about overcoming confusion, not following rules. About understanding, not worship. That alone made this gospel dangerous. But what came next made it even more so. After Jesus leaves, the disciples are confused and scared. They don't know what to do. And Mary steps forward, not just to comfort them, but to teach them. She shares what Jesus told her in private: visions, wisdom, and spiritual truths that don't appear in any other gospel. Some of the male disciples question her. They can't believe Jesus would trust her with knowledge they didn't receive. One even accuses her of lying, but others, like Peter, eventually listen. And that's where the manuscript breaks off, torn, missing pages. The gospel was damaged long ago, maybe even on purpose. But the part that survives is enough to see what it once was. A version of the story where Mary isn't just a follower, she's a messenger, a leader, a voice the church later silenced. The Gospel of Mary paints a very different picture of Jesus. Not as a divine figure who demanded worship, but as a guide who wanted people to find the divine within themselves. He didn't say, "Follow me." He said, "Know yourself." He didn't say, "Obey." He said, "Understand." That message didn't fit the church's plan. The early church built its power on the idea that people needed saving, and that only priests, rituals, and strict doctrine could provide it. But if people believed they already had what they needed inside them, the whole system would fall apart. So the gospel was buried, labelled heresy, and forgotten for centuries, until it wasn't. Now, fragments of the Gospel of Mary sit in museums, studied by scholars, whispered about in documentaries. It's still incomplete, but what it suggests is huge. A Messiah who didn't come to rule, but to remind us that we were never truly lost to begin with. And maybe the voice of Mary didn't disappear. Maybe it was just waiting for the world to finally listen. In the smoky corners of medieval Europe, strange books began to appear, filled with symbols, coded drawings, and impossible recipes. They spoke of turning lead into gold, of finding the philosopher's stone, and of discovering the elixir of life. At first glance, these seemed like wild fantasies, magic, myth, but alchemists weren't just chasing treasure, they were hiding something deeper, something powerful, something that had to be disguised to survive. Alchemy looked like madness. Boil this metal under moonlight, mix that powder with morning dew, draw a circle, say a prayer. But behind the strange rituals and ancient symbols was a different kind of language, a code. And for those who could read between the lines, it wasn't about gold at all, it was about knowledge. Hidden knowledge, scientific truth buried beneath layers of spiritual metaphor. Alchemists weren't fools. Many were brilliant minds, early chemists, astronomers, and philosophers who studied matter, energy, and transformation. But in a time when the church controlled science and labelled curiosity as sin, they had to be careful. If you wanted to talk about atoms, medicine, or energy, you couldn't say it directly. So they wrapped their discoveries in mystery. They called it the Great Work. And they made sure that only those who truly understood could follow the trail. Take the idea of turning lead into gold. On the surface, it sounds like greed. But lead represented the heavy, raw material of the self, and gold symbolized enlightenment. The transformation was never just physical, it was personal, mental. Alchemists were saying that the real treasure wasn't outside, it was within. That through study, practice, and reflection, a person could become something more, not richer, brighter. This idea that humans hold a light inside them was dangerous, because the church taught that light only came from God, and only through the church. If someone believed they had their own inner light, they might stop obeying, stop fearing, start thinking. So alchemists hid in plain sight. Their books were filled with fire-breathing dragons and talking suns. But behind every image was a formula, a theory, a lesson about the natural world. Some even believe that ancient alchemical texts included early knowledge of chemistry, medicine, and even electricity, long before those sciences had names. And the Vatican? They collected those books, not to share them, but to lock them away. Many alchemical manuscripts ended up in secret archives, unread and untranslated, labelled heretical, too esoteric for the faithful. But the truth is, the alchemists weren't hiding nonsense, they were hiding science. In a world where open discovery could get you silenced, or worse, they chose symbols over sentences, metaphors over manuals, and through that, they kept the flame of human knowledge alive. Maybe they never found gold, but what they left behind was even more valuable, a secret language of light, waiting to be decoded by anyone bold enough to believe the real treasure was never in the metal, but in the mind. Cathedrals were supposed to be places of worship, holy spaces where stone met sky, and prayers echoed through vaulted ceilings. But what if some of them were more than that? What if buried beneath the stained glass and saints, hidden in carvings and floor patterns, were secrets, maps to a different kind of truth? For centuries, people believed these grand buildings were built only to glorify God. But the deeper you look, the stranger things get. The shapes, the symbols, the way light moves through windows at specific times of year, the floor plans that line up with star constellations. It's almost like these buildings weren't just designed to inspire faith, they were designed to hide knowledge in plain sight. At the heart of many cathedrals, right under your feet, lies a pattern most people never notice. Spirals, stars, strange geometric designs. Some are so precise they form perfect mathematical ratios, ratios used in nature, music, even modern science. But how did medieval builders know these things? And why include them in a church? One of the most mysterious examples is the labyrinth carved into the stone floor of Chartres Cathedral in France. From above, it looks like a maze, but it's not meant to trap anyone. It's a path, a single winding route from the edge to the centre. Some believe it's symbolic of a spiritual journey. Others say it's a secret code. The shape matches patterns found in ancient Greek temples and even Egyptian monuments. A link between old worlds and the new stories built over them. And it doesn't stop at the floor. Certain columns are carved with symbols from forgotten alphabets. Some windows show scenes not found in the Bible, but in banned books, the Apocrypha, Gospels that were excluded, even fragments of ancient myths, angels holding compasses, saints standing in front of star charts, builders sneaking in shapes that mirror constellations, planets, and solar alignments. Why? Because the architects weren't just stonemasons. Many were part of secret guilds, groups that passed down knowledge through symbols, not words. They couldn't write what they knew, so they built it instead. Into walls, into ceilings, into the light that shines through a stained glass window on only one day of the year, revealing a symbol only the trained eye would notice. The church likely knew parts of this, but as long as the buildings pointed toward heaven and the people kept praying, the deeper meanings were allowed to stay buried. So while the faithful walked above, whispering prayers, something else waited below. A map, a message, a silent record carved in stone by hands that believed truth should never be erased, only hidden well enough to survive. And maybe that's the real miracle of these cathedrals. Not what was preached inside them, but what was secretly built into their bones. Long before the printing press, long before libraries were open to the public, there were whispers of people working in the shadows to protect knowledge. Not just monks or scribes, but secret groups, builders, thinkers, wanderers, who passed down information the world wasn't ready for. They weren't just trying to preserve facts. They were trying to preserve memory, and they knew that some truths had to be hidden to survive. One of the most famous groups were the Freemasons. Today, they're known mostly for their symbols, the compass, the square, the all-seeing eye, but their roots go much deeper. In medieval times, Masons were the master builders of Europe. They designed cathedrals, castles, even cities. But many believe the Freemasons weren't just architects of stone, they were architects of secrecy. They spoke in symbols, passed on their knowledge through rituals, built structures filled with hidden meanings, sacred geometry, and references to ancient ideas older than Christianity. Some say their wisdom came from Egypt, or even Atlantis. Others believe they were the bridge between lost civilizations and the modern world. Either way, the Masons saw themselves as guardians, not of religion, but of memory. Then there were the mystics, alchemists, philosophers, and travelers who belonged to no single faith, but studied all of them. They looked for patterns in everything: stars, numbers, dreams. Some joined secret societies, like the Rosicrucians, a group that claimed to hold the invisible history of the world. Stories about how ancient knowledge had been scattered, and how their mission was to keep it alive in silence. And they weren't alone. Across continents, similar groups began to appear. In the Islamic world, there were the Brethren of Purity, philosophers who shared secret writings in code. In India, sages passed on forbidden truths through poetry and metaphor. In China, Taoist scholars wrote about energy, balance, and transformation, wrapping their science in layers of spiritual language. They were all different, but they shared one thing in common. They believed real wisdom couldn't always be spoken openly, not in a world where powerful systems feared change. So they created networks, quiet, hidden, almost invisible. Some wrote books that looked like fairy tales, but were actually guides to astronomy or medicine. Some carved symbols into stone. Some built underground libraries. Others passed messages by word of mouth for generations, trusting that one day someone would understand. And maybe that day is now, because scattered through history are signs that they succeeded. Manuscripts discovered in caves, maps that predate discovery, buildings aligned with stars. Knowledge that shouldn't exist unless someone made sure it did. These weren't just rebels or dreamers. They were memory keepers. People who understood that if the wrong hands held the truth, it would be twisted or lost. So they hid it, not to control it, but to protect it. And now, their symbols are all around us, on old buildings, in ancient books, carved into walls we walk past every day, never realizing that someone, long ago, left us a message, waiting to be remembered. What if we told you that almost 300 years of history, entire kings, wars, inventions, and even centuries, might have never happened at all? Not forgotten, not lost, just made up. That's the idea behind one of the strangest and most unsettling theories in history, the phantom time hypothesis. It sounds like a movie plot, but some historians, scientists, and researchers have taken it seriously. The theory says that the years between around 614 and 911 AD, roughly 297 years, were added into the calendar on purpose. That means everything we think happened during that stretch of time may not have happened at all. It all starts with a man named Heribert Illig, a German historian who noticed some odd things about the early Middle Ages. First, there aren't many records. For nearly 300 years, Europe is unusually quiet. Hardly any writing, very few buildings, no clear progress, just legends. And when records do exist, they're often vague or written long after the events supposedly happened. Illig also pointed to the calendars. The Julian calendar, created by the Romans, was off by a bit. When Pope Gregory XIII introduced the Gregorian calendar in 1582, he deleted 10 days to correct it. But according to Illig's math, if the calendar had really been counting time correctly since Roman days, it should have been off by about 13 days. So, where did those 3 extra days, or rather centuries, go? He believed they were never real in the first place. According to the theory, the people who added this phantom time may have had a reason. The most common suspect, Emperor Otto III, along with Pope Sylvester II. It's said they wanted to be ruling during the year 1000, the millennium, because it sounded holy and important. So, they adjusted the dates to make it seem like they were living in that moment. To make the numbers fit, they needed to stretch history. So they did. One of the most suspicious figures is Charlemagne, a legendary emperor from this phantom period. His story feels almost too perfect. He united Europe, built schools, reformed the church, but much of what we know about him comes from documents written long after he died, and there's almost no physical evidence that he existed at all. No bones, no crown, no real-time letters or notes, just stories. Supporters of the theory also point out strange overlaps in architecture, art, and even star maps. Some say that eclipses and comets from that period don't match where they should be in the sky if the timeline were real. It's like the sky and the calendar are telling 2 different stories. Of course, most historians say this theory is wrong, but they don't always explain the gaps. They don't always account for the silence. Maybe those years really happened, or maybe they were carefully placed, like extra pages in a book, to fill space, to shape a narrative, or to hide something else. And if almost 300 years can be created from nothing, what else in history was never really there? History is supposed to follow a straight line. One thing leads to another. Empires rise, inventions happen, people move forward. But when you start looking closely at the timeline we've all been taught, cracks begin to show. Some events seem too perfectly placed. Others appear twice under different names. And sometimes, entire civilizations vanish, only to reappear later, as if nothing happened. These aren't just gaps, they're contradictions. And they raise one big question. Did someone build the timeline the way a story is written, not the way it really happened? Let's start with technology. In some ancient ruins, you find things that seem way too advanced for their time. giant stone blocks cut with machine-like precision, star charts more accurate than what should have been possible. Ancient Greek texts describe machines powered by steam, and yet that technology disappears for over 1,000 years before it shows up again in the 1800s. How does something like that get lost for over a millennium? Then there's the problem of repetition. Some kings in different centuries seem like carbon copies, different names, but the same victories, the same reforms, even the same types of death. Historians say it's coincidence, or that one king was just inspired by another. But what if someone simply copied an earlier story to fill in the blanks of a time they didn't fully understand? And don't forget about architecture. Roman-style buildings pop up in places that supposedly had no contact with Rome. Cathedrals built during the so-called Dark Ages suddenly show design skills that supposedly hadn't been seen since ancient Greece. There's almost no learning curve, just a jump from basic stonework to mathematical perfection. Where did that knowledge come from if everything was supposed to be forgotten? Chronology, the timeline of human history, is based on piecing together fragments, old texts, coins, letters, buildings. But much of it is guesswork, and the church controlled most of the pieces for centuries. They decided which texts to preserve, which stories to spread, and which to quietly ignore. Over time, a version of history was built that supported their worldview. A fall from grace, a long period of darkness, then a rise back into light, guided, of course, by the church itself. But outside of Europe, other cultures tell different stories. Ancient Chinese and Persian records don't always match Western dates. Islamic scholars recorded events that don't fit the Christian calendar. Even the stars, when matched to recorded eclipses, sometimes disagree with the official timeline. It's like different clocks are ticking at different speeds. So what is history really made of? Memory? Power? Belief? Maybe the truth isn't just missing. Maybe it was never allowed to connect, like puzzle pieces that were bent to fit a picture someone else was trying to paint. And if the links in time were broken on purpose, then the past we know might just be a story, written not to tell us what happened, but to shape what we believe happened. Long before church bells rang, before crosses stood on cathedrals, before the Bible was even a thought, there may have been a book. A strange ancient text that didn't belong to any religion, yet seemed to hold truths that echoed through all of them. It didn't speak of heaven or hell. It didn't demand worship. It simply told of how the world worked, how energy moved, how time flowed, how humans carried light inside of them. Some believe this book predated Christianity, and that's exactly why it had to disappear. Stories of this book show up in fragments. A page here, a symbol there. Always hidden, always incomplete. In early Gnostic texts, there are hints about a primordial wisdom, knowledge that existed before temples or priests. Some early Jewish and Egyptian writings talk about a source of truth that wasn't passed down by prophets, but remembered by the soul. A truth you didn't learn, but recognized when you saw it. According to some old legends, this book wasn't written by man, but discovered, carved into stone or metal, buried beneath sand, or sealed in a cave. Some said it could unlock the secrets of the stars, the self, and even time itself. Others said it taught that God wasn't a ruler above, but a spark within, that you didn't need saving. You needed remembering. It's said that the early church found traces of this book and panicked. Not because it was evil, but because it offered a path that bypassed them. A path where people didn't need priests, rituals, or sacred buildings. Just the willingness to look inward, to question, to awaken. that kind of freedom was dangerous. So the story goes that pieces of this book were copied in secret by early thinkers. Some disguised them as religious texts. Others encoded them into symbols, hiding them in cathedrals, temples, and even everyday objects. One version may have been hidden inside the Gospel of Thomas, another inside the teachings of Mary Magdalene, and still more in the cryptic writings of alchemists, mystics, and memory keepers. The church never spoke of it directly, but it began erasing anything that hinted at it. Whole gospels were banned, schools were burned. The idea that wisdom could exist outside church control was hunted down and silenced. But some believe the book still exists, maybe not as one object, but as a trail, a collection of clues scattered across history, a sentence in a lost scroll, a symbol carved into a cathedral wall, a line in a banned poem, a pattern buried in ancient architecture, and maybe that's how it was meant to survive. Not as a book you hold in your hands, but as a story you discover piece by piece. A story that reminds you that the deepest truths don't come from outside. They come from somewhere much older and much closer, somewhere inside you. While Europe slipped into what it called the Dark Ages, other parts of the world were wide awake. In the East, especially in China and the Islamic world, time was being carefully measured, recorded, and remembered. While Western monks were copying scriptures by candlelight, Chinese astronomers were charting supernovas. While European kings were forgetting how to build roads, Islamic scholars were building libraries that held knowledge from every corner of the known world. And here's where things get weird. If you compare the timeline of European history with the records from China or the Islamic Golden Age, things don't always line up. Events that should be huge, massive wars, famines, rulers said to have changed the world, barely show up in Eastern records. Sometimes they don't appear at all. And the more you look, the more it starts to feel like someone rewrote Europe's past, while the East just kept the clock running. In China, record keeping was serious. Every emperor had scribes. Every major event, like eclipses, natural disasters, or wars, was written down. Their star maps were so accurate that modern scientists have confirmed many of their observations. And yet, during the years when Europe claimed to be rising or falling, especially in those phantom centuries, from the 7th to the 10th, China's records show little to no sign that anything major was happening in the West. The Islamic world was the same. While Europe was supposedly crumbling, the Middle East was thriving. Baghdad had hospitals, observatories, and universities, while cities like Rome were falling apart. Scholars translated texts from Greek, Persian, and Indian sources, preserving them and even improving on them. They developed algebra, mapped the stars, and wrote about medicine in ways that were centuries ahead of Europe. And yet, when European history talks about its dark centuries, it acts as though the whole world went quiet. But that's not what the East says. According to their records, time never stopped. The stars kept moving. Empires rose and fell. Knowledge kept growing. So why the difference? Some believe Europe's timeline was altered, either stretched to match religious prophecy or compressed to cover up lost years. And because the Church controlled most of the historical writing, they could decide what stayed and what didn't. But the East had its own systems that didn't rely on popes or priests, systems that didn't need to erase anything. The result? 2 versions of time, one that moves smoothly, and one filled with holes. If we trust the East's records, and many scientists do, then it becomes harder to believe Europe's version without question. not because it's all fake, but because when timelines don't match, someone, somewhere, rewrote the clock. And maybe the real keepers of time weren't the ones with the biggest churches or loudest voices. Maybe they were the ones who just kept writing, quietly, while the rest of the world forgot. High above us, the stars have always told stories. Before there were clocks, before there were calendars, people looked up to understand time. Eclipses, comets, the positions of planets, they were like nature's handwriting across the sky. And the most amazing thing? Unlike books, stars can't be edited. They follow the same patterns every time. That's why ancient astronomers, especially in places like China and the Islamic world, kept incredibly detailed records of what they saw. And that's also why, when you compare those records to the timeline the Vatican approved, things start to get strange. Imagine you're reading about a solar eclipse that happened during the rule of a certain European king. The church says it was the year 775. But when scientists check the sky using computer simulations, rewinding the stars to see what the sky really looked like back then, there's a problem. No eclipse shows up for that date, not even close. Either the church got the year wrong, or the event never happened. And it's not just one eclipse. There are dozens of moments in medieval history tied to celestial events, eclipses, comets, star alignments. They were big deals. People saw them as omens, signs from heaven. Writers recorded them in detail. But when those same events are lined up with what we now know about the sky's behaviour, the timing doesn't fit. The stars don't lie, but the dates we've been given might. One of the biggest red flags comes from Halley's Comet. It shows up roughly every 76 years, and ancient cultures all over the world saw it. Chinese records mention it like clockwork. But in Europe, during key centuries where major events were said to happen, the comet sometimes goes completely unmentioned, or it's mentioned at the wrong time. If Europe had really experienced it when they said they did, the Chinese records should match. But they don't. So what does that mean? Some researchers think the timeline was stretched or squeezed by accident. Others believe it was intentional. If someone wanted to match up a religious event, like the birth of Christ or a major church council, with a dramatic sign in the sky, it would be tempting to adjust the dates. After all, people trusted the church to interpret both history and the heavens. But the stars don't care about stories. They just shine, move, and return, always on time. And when the sky says one thing while the books say another, maybe it's not the sky that's wrong. Astronomy has become like a truth detector, one that can see through centuries of edits, and the more it looks back, the more it reveals that time might not be as solid as we think. That dates we've memorized might not match reality, and that the stars, quiet and steady, may be the only historians we can truly trust. Time is supposed to be constant, 1 second after another, 1 year following the next, like beads on a perfect string. But what if time, at least the way we measure it, has been edited, cut, stretched, and rearranged, like a story someone didn't want you to read straight through? It sounds wild, but think about it. Most of what we know about the past comes from books, scrolls, carvings, and calendars. And for over 1,000 years, those things were controlled by a small group of people, the church, kings, scribes, who decided what was worth keeping and what could be adjusted. If a certain date didn't fit the narrative, it could be changed. If a ruler wanted to trace his bloodline back to a legend, the timeline could be bent to make it true. If prophecy said something important should happen in a specific year, then time could be shaped to match it. This wasn't always done with evil in mind. Sometimes it was about power, sometimes about pride. But the effect was the same. The clock of civilization became a book, one that could be rewritten. Take the calendar. The one we use today is the Gregorian calendar, introduced by Pope Gregory XIII in 1582. It replaced the Julian calendar, which had slowly drifted out of sync with the seasons. To fix it, the Pope skipped 10 entire days. People went to bed on October 4 and woke up on October 15. Just like that, time had been edited. But what if that wasn't the only change? Some researchers believe that earlier edits happened too, big ones. They point to the strange silence in Europe's early medieval years, where very little seems to happen for centuries. They ask why so many kings from different times share the same life stories, victories, and even personalities. And they look at astronomical records, like eclipses and comet sightings, that don't match the official dates in our history books. When you put all of that together, it starts to feel like someone was cleaning up history, moving things around, erasing parts that didn't fit, inserting parts that made the church look stronger, or made certain rulers seem chosen by God. Imagine if the fall of Rome didn't really happen when we think it did, or if Charlemagne wasn't a real person, but a mix of several rulers combined into one heroic legend, or if 300 years were added to the timeline to make sure a religious prophecy happened in the right year. In that case, time didn't just pass, it was crafted. And maybe the strangest part? Most people would never notice. Because once you're taught a timeline in school, it becomes truth. You stop questioning, you stop looking. But what if the clock we live by isn't a clock at all? What if it's a story, and someone long ago decided how that story should begin, where it should pause, and what parts should be forgotten forever? Scattered across the world, inside caves, under ancient ruins, and tucked into forgotten libraries, are pages. Not full books, just pieces, torn scrolls, burnt corners, bits of writing in strange languages, or symbols no one can quite decode. These fragments don't belong to any known story. They don't match any religious text, official history, or famous myth. And yet, they exist. Real, mysterious, like keys waiting for a lock that no longer exists. Some of these fragments were found in places they shouldn't be, like a scrap of writing buried with an Egyptian mummy, written in a language that looks almost Greek, but not quite. Or a thin copper plate in India covered in markings that no modern script can explain. They show up in deserts, in underground tunnels, sometimes even hidden inside the bindings of other books. And when experts try to fit them into the puzzle of known history, nothing works. That's where the name comes from. A key without a lock. These are pieces of something bigger, something older, but the full story is gone, either lost or taken. Some researchers think these fragments may have come from an ancient book, or even a set of books, that was erased from history, not by fire, but by forgetting. It's possible that whatever they belonged to was deliberately removed from libraries, burned by religious authorities, or hidden away so deeply that only the smallest parts survived. And those parts? They don't follow the same rules. One fragment describes a creation story that isn't from any known religion. It talks about the world being born from vibration, not from light or darkness. Another speaks of time as something humans once understood how to shape. There are mentions of machines made of crystal, people communicating without speech, even symbols that some say resemble modern circuitry, written thousands of years ago. Of course, most historians call these ideas nonsense. They say the fragments are misinterpreted, that they're just pieces of poetry or random scribbles with no meaning, but others see a pattern. They believe these aren't just leftovers from lost stories, they're warnings, or maps, or pieces of a message meant to be passed down quietly through time. Think of it this way. If someone wanted to hide a powerful truth, they wouldn't leave it all in one place. They'd scatter it, break it, let it blend into myths and ruins, hoping one day someone curious enough might notice the pieces, might realize they're holding a key. But without the lock, the full meaning stays out of reach. That's the mystery. What was this knowledge? Who wrote it? And why has it never been taught? Maybe the lock is still out there. Or maybe we are the lock. Maybe the human mind, curious, questioning, never fully asleep, is the thing that can finally put the pieces together. And when it does, that quiet little fragment might just unlock the part of history we were never supposed to remember. In 1998, a quiet but brilliant scholar named Dr. Elias Verno arrived in Rome. He wasn't famous. He didn't give interviews or write flashy books. But behind closed doors, people whispered that he was onto something big. He had spent nearly 15 years researching inconsistencies in medieval timelines, tracking lost texts, and digging into the Vatican's lesser-known archives. And then, one day, he vanished. Dr. Verno had a strange obsession. Time. Not clocks, but history itself. How dates were recorded, how calendars shifted, how certain events repeated too perfectly. He believed that some centuries had been fabricated, added to the timeline like blank pages filled in by someone with too much power and too little truth. He called it manuscript time. History rewritten like a story, edited to fit the needs of kings and churches. His last known project focused on a rare manuscript found in a monastery north of Venice. The book, badly damaged and written in a forgotten dialect, described a hidden meeting between early church leaders. According to Dr. Verno's notes, the text hinted that parts of European history had been altered to fulfill a prophecy. Names were changed, dates were shifted, entire rulers may have been created from myths. He brought those notes with him to Rome. The plan was to visit the Vatican Library. He had finally been granted a special temporary pass, an almost impossible thing to get. For 3 days, he studied in a private reading room deep beneath Vatican Hill. On the 4th day, he didn't return to his hotel. His room was untouched. His notes, laptop, and passport were all left behind. No one ever saw him again. Authorities searched. His family pleaded. But the investigation faded quietly. Official reports said there was no sign of foul play. No clear reason to suspect anything unusual. Just a man who walked into one of the most secretive places on Earth and didn't walk out. Some say he had a breakdown, that he ran off to live in hiding. Others believe he died accidentally, maybe got trapped in a part of the archives not meant to be accessed alone. But people close to him don't buy those stories. They remember the quiet fear in his voice the week before he left. The way he said things like, "If I'm right, they'll never let this see the light of day." And then there's the strangest part. A package. 2 months after he vanished, an anonymous envelope arrived at the university where he worked. Inside were photocopies of hand-drawn maps, pages of medieval Latin, and one note, written in his handwriting. It said, "They buried time, but not deep enough." To this day, no one knows what he found, or if he's still alive. But the pages remain, and so does the question he spent his life asking. What if the story of history was written to keep us from finding out the truth? Beneath Vatican City, lies one of the most secret places on Earth, a massive archive, sealed behind iron gates and guarded by centuries of silence. People call it the Vatican Secret Archive, though its official name changed to make it sound less mysterious. But no matter what it's called, one thing hasn't changed. Most of what's inside remains hidden, locked away from the public, from scholars, even from most popes. Yes, there are whispers that parts of the archive are so restricted, not even the leader of the Catholic Church is allowed inside. It sounds impossible. How could the Pope, supposedly the most powerful figure in the Vatican, be denied access to anything? But according to old rumours, passed around by ex-archivists, quiet historians, and brave whistleblowers, there are chambers within the archive that are sealed with more than just locks. They are sealed by tradition, by secrecy, by fear. Some say these sections hold documents so explosive they could shake the foundations of religion, politics, or even history itself. Not just letters and lost gospels, but maps that don't match our world, timelines that contradict everything we've been taught, and ancient texts that suggest Earth's story is far older and far stranger than we think. There's talk of a black vault, a room deep beneath the main archive where forbidden manuscripts are kept in reinforced cases. The keys, held only by a small group known as the custodians, sworn to silence, bound by oaths older than the Vatican itself. Not even the Pope can override them. Each new pontiff is briefed on the contents of the main archive, but the Black Vault? That part is off limits. For the protection of the faith, they say. One legend tells of Pope John, a modern and curious man, who asked to see the sealed vault in the 1960s. He was told gently but firmly that it was not advisable. Not because it was unsafe, but because once he saw what was inside, he could never unsee it. After that meeting, he rarely spoke of the archives again. No cameras are allowed inside. Only a handful of people can enter each day, and only with special permission. Scholars can't browse freely. They must request specific documents by name. But how do you ask for something if you don't know it exists? The silence surrounding these sealed chambers is louder than any denial. It suggests that whatever lies behind those stone walls, behind the final locked doors, doesn't just challenge the Church's story. It challenges everyone's. Maybe it's ancient history that rewrites the origins of mankind. Maybe it's proof of civilizations far older than Egypt or Sumer. Or maybe it's the truth about time itself, buried so deep that even the most powerful man in the Church has no key. Whatever it is, it's still there, waiting, hidden in the one place on earth where even a pope must knock and might still be told no. Not all secrets are hidden because they're wrong. Some are hidden because they're too powerful, because the world wasn't ready, because if the wrong person heard them at the wrong time, everything could fall apart. That's the idea behind a strange but haunting theory. What if certain truths weren't buried to protect people from lies, but to protect them from truths they weren't ready for? It's called The Truth Too Soon. Imagine discovering a map that shows the continents as they looked before the last ice age, or a book that explains how sound and vibration can heal the body, something modern science is only beginning to explore, or a document that proves humans have risen and fallen more than once, that we're not the first advanced civilization. Imagine holding that knowledge in your hands, knowing it could rewrite everything, and realizing no one would believe you. That's the kind of knowledge this theory talks about. Information so ahead of its time that it wouldn't just challenge the system, it would break it. Ancient philosophers spoke of something called sacred knowledge. Not just facts, but understanding that changed how people saw reality itself. It was powerful and dangerous. Some said it could only be passed down in secret, from teacher to student. Others believed it had to be protected until a future generation was wise enough to use it without turning it into a weapon. And maybe that's what happened. Maybe some knowledge was discovered thousands of years ago, maybe by travelers, mystics, monks, even scientists. But when they shared it, they were mocked, imprisoned, or worse. Not because they were wrong, but because they were too early. So that knowledge was hidden, locked in vaults, buried in coded texts, disguised as myth, protected not by chains, but by silence. And still, it tries to resurface. In forgotten books, in strange symbols found under cathedrals, in stories passed down by secret societies, pieces of a truth that never quite goes away. Some believe the church wasn't trying to destroy knowledge, but delay it. That they knew humanity had to go through certain steps first, had to build slowly, had to be humble enough to ask the right questions. Because truth, in the wrong hands, isn't light, it's fire. But what if that time is now? What if the world is finally catching up? What if ancient wisdom about energy, the mind, the stars, even time itself is slowly being remembered? Maybe we're the generation the secrets were hidden for, not from. And maybe that's why the edges of history are starting to crack. Why the past is suddenly full of questions. Not because the lies are falling apart, but because the truth is finally knocking on the door at exactly the right time. Somewhere, hidden behind stone or buried beneath earth, the book might still be there, not burned, not lost, not torn into pieces like so many others, but whole, intact, waiting. For centuries, people have whispered about a forbidden book, a manuscript older than the church, older than kingdoms, older maybe than history itself. A book said to hold a truth too deep, too powerful, too world-shaking to be shared. Most believe it was destroyed long ago, but some think it never was, that it survived the fires. That someone, somewhere, protected it. There are stories, a scroll sealed in lead and buried beneath a collapsed temple, a book bound in strange leather, locked in a vault no one has opened in 500 years. A crate taken from Alexandria before the great library burned, smuggled across seas by men who swore an oath of silence. Always the same pattern, vanishing just before it could be found, slipping through cracks in time. And then there are the clues. Pages that seem to be missing from other ancient texts. Diagrams that stop mid-thought, as if the real answers are in another volume. Strange symbols that show up in carvings across continents, as if scattered pieces are pointing towards something larger, something central. The book, they say, doesn't just contain knowledge, it is knowledge about time, about memory, about the connection between the stars and the soul. It doesn't demand belief. It reveals what's always been there, quietly, underneath everything we were told to accept. Some call it myth, others call it prophecy. But more and more, it's starting to feel like a possibility. Maybe it's hidden in the Vatican's deepest vault, under layers of keys no one admits exist. Maybe it's buried in a desert cave, sealed in a jar just like the Dead Sea Scrolls once were. Maybe it's already been found, but locked away in a private collection, kept quiet by someone too afraid of what might happen if it's read. And maybe, just maybe, it hasn't been found because it's waiting for the right reader. Not a scholar, not a pope, not a ruler, just someone who still knows how to ask real questions. Someone who isn't trying to use it for power, but for understanding. It could be anywhere. A monastery basement, a wall with a hollow sound, a place no one thinks to look because they've already decided it couldn't possibly still exist. But what if it does? What if the book is out there, right now, quiet and complete, hidden in plain sight? What if it's waiting not to be found, but to be understood? And what if everything, every forgotten page, every missing year, every story told in whispers has been leading us to this one truth, that the book was never lost. It was just unread. History isn't just dates and battles. It's memory, collective memory. It's what we choose to remember, and just as often, what we're told to forget. Over time, those choices become our truth. They shape who we think we are, what we believe is possible, and how we understand the world around us. But what happens when history begins to wake up? Not all at once, not like a lightning strike, more like a slow stirring, a pattern in a cathedral floor, a missing century that no one can explain, a gospel found in a cave that says something different than what we were taught. At first, it feels like coincidence, but eventually it starts to feel like something more, like memory returning. Throughout this journey, we've seen how knowledge can be hidden, burned, locked away, rewritten, not because it was false, but because it gave people too much power, too much freedom. A truth that says you don't need permission to think. A truth that reminds you the light isn't just in temples or books, it's in you. That kind of knowledge doesn't die. Even when it's buried, it lingers, it waits. And sometimes it returns through fragments. A scroll here, a story there. Pieces that don't quite fit until you stop looking for the official version and start seeing what's been underneath the whole time. The line between forgetting and freedom is razor thin. If you forget too much, who you are, where you came from, what was taken, you become easier to control. But if you remember, really remember, suddenly you start asking questions. Why was this erased? Who decided what counts as truth? What was lost in the silence? That's when freedom begins. Not with rebellion, not with breaking things, but with remembering, with seeing the past, not as something to memorize, but as something to recover. Not just the facts, but the possibilities that were buried with them. Maybe that's what all the missing years, hidden books, and strange alignments are really about. Not just a conspiracy, not just a mystery, but an invitation to wake up, because history doesn't just live in dusty archives or locked vaults. It lives in the stories we pass down, the questions we dare to ask, the quiet feeling that something isn't quite right with the version we were given. And maybe, just maybe, this isn't the end of the story. Maybe it's the beginning. A new chapter, written not by popes or kings, but by all of us. Not about control, but connection. Not about forgetting, but finally remembering. Because once history wakes up, so do we.